Hi, everybody. My topic is how change happens. This is connected with what's happening in the world, both with the pandemic and with Black Lives Matter. It has to do with products as well as national politics. It has to do with local politics and sex equality, too. The topic is daunting to me, and I was blocked on it until two things happened, and these are both in the nature of stories. So a few years ago, I found myself in a group of about 8 to 10 people with one of the world's great athletes. He's very tall. I'm not going to tell you his name, and the reason will become clear in a moment. I thought I'd ask him a question I always wanted to ask a great athlete. And I said to him, if there's very little time left in the game and everything depends on you, it's all on your shoulders. The future of the team, the success, all depends on you. And he's good enough, he's famous enough and talented enough that this is realistic. It really does depend on him. I looked at him and I said, in those moments, are you having fun? And he looked around at our little group of 8 or 10. He paused and he said to me, absolutely. If there's little time left in the game and it's all on me, that's what I was born for. I'm in my element. It's the best time of my life. If you ask me, am I having fun? The answer is the best fun you can imagine. Now, that answer surprised me, I confess. I play a little sport called squash, and I know some of the really good players, and I wouldn't expect that answer. So, about an hour later, I found myself in the corner of the room with no one to talk to, and about 4 meters away was the great athlete standing by himself. I kind of beckoned him over near a curtain, and I told him, your answer surprised me. Is that really true? You're having fun? And he said, you asked me if when the pressure's on my shoulders, I'm having fun. You want to hear the real answer? And I said, sure. And he said, no, it's horrible. He said, don't get me wrong. I know what to do. I'm good at it. And he's famously good at it. But he said, it's not fun for me. It's terrible. It's an awful experience. I can bear it, but that's not fun. Okay, what interested me about this was that he was willing to tell me in private, in circumstances of trust, something that he would not say in front of a group of as many as 10 people, one of whom was probably a journalist, and he's famous enough that this would end up in the newspaper. Okay, here's the other thing involving social change that's more political, and it's a study of Saudi Arabia relatively recently. A group of young men in Saudi Arabia who by custom have authority over whether their wives work outside of the home, a group of young men, large group, were asked in a randomized trial, do you feel okay about your wife working outside of the home? And the answer was overwhelmingly, yes, I'm completely in favor of that. That's a good thing. Then the young men were asked, and what do you think the norm is? What do you think other young men in Saudi Arabia think in response to this question? And the answer was almost uniformly, overwhelmingly, oh, other young men hate the idea. I'm very unusual in this. The widely shared view is it's a bad idea. Women shouldn't be working outside of the home. Okay, here's where the experiment got interesting. Half of those young men were corrected. They were told, actually, your private view is the same as the private view of men like you. Your view is widely shared. The other half was not corrected in that way. 4 months later, the number of women in the treatment group for whom the general norm was disclosed, the number of wives who were applying for jobs and interviewing jobs outside of the home skyrocketed. Those families, in a way, went whoosh in the direction of something like sex equality. Okay, these two stories are the same story. They are a story about how what we have inside our heads is often very different from what we're prepared to say publicly and what we're prepared to act on. And I want that to be the first moving part, it's called preference falsification, for an account of social change. This helps explain the unanticipated nature of much of what we've seen of late, including Brexit, including the rise of hashtag #MeToo, It helps explain the rise of much of what we've seen in the 20th century, including the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the rise of fascism in the 1930s. To vindicate the premise of the enterprise, which is the unpredictable nature of social change, let's just notice that Tocqueville himself said that the French Revolution was anticipated by no one. That's Tocqueville at the time. Lenin, if anyone was the architect of the Soviet Revolution, it was Lenin. Lenin was shocked by the success and speed of the Soviet Revolution. Okay, I want to try to explain movements that involve products, maybe the iPad, that involve culture, Taylor Swift, that involve politics, Black Lives Matter, and that involve basically small things that are happening in communities all over the world with four moving parts. The first is preference falsification. The second is diverse thresholds. The third is social interactions. And the fourth is group polarization. Four is more than I'd like, but each of them is blissfully simple. The stories I told are stories of preference falsification. And to get a hold of the power of it, the most relevant book on Nazism actually comes from the 1950s. It's about what made Nazism possible. And an American of German heritage went back to his country and tried to figure out what made that society go a kind of horrifically whoosh direction. And he met 10 former Nazis, and he liked all of them. They became his friends. And he asked one, "Didn't you oppose Hitler? How did this happen?" And the answer was very eloquent. It was opposition. How would anyone know? How would anyone know what someone opposes or doesn't oppose? Whether he says he opposes depends on the circumstances. When, where, and whom he's talking to. And even then, you must still guess why he says what he says. That is a very eloquent prose poem. And the basic idea is with respect to any number of things, we all have in our heads at least some thoughts that we don't voice publicly, that we may voice to no one, possibly will tell our partner or spouse or our closest friend, but possibly not even that. And that means that the rise of some social change, hashtag Me Too is a case in point, comes from giving someone a kind of green light or a permission slip to say what's actually inside their minds. We all live in a state of pluralistic ignorance, as it's called, in which we don't know what other people think. We just don't. And once they disclose what they think, it might be that we'll start doing or saying something very different. The fact is that even in the most democratic and freest of societies, people are often silenced by social norms and a perception of what others think, and a green light coming from an interviewer in Saudi Arabia or apparently trustworthy law professor near a curtain inside a large room can liberate someone to say or do something that they wouldn't otherwise say or do. Okay, the second moving part also comes from a personal story, and this is diverse thresholds. Slightly embarrassing story. I found myself a few years ago in a dangerous part of the world where no one spoke English. And I walked with a friend who was Irish American. I want to emphasize the word Irish in that because it's relevant. In a street which was mildly frightening and which had no English speakers. About 200 meters from where we were walking, we saw a man beating up his son. Son was about 10 years old, and he was just pummeling the son. Before I could register what happened, my friend had run those 200 meters as if he was an Olympic athlete, though he wasn't. He ran fast and started yelling in English at the father, "Stop beating up your son." And while I much doubt that the father understood English, he understood the emotion. And I was right behind my friend. He went first, I went second. And the father looked initially startled and then abashed and raised his hands as if to say peace and looked a little ashamed and put his arm around his son and walked off gently. In that story, my Irish American friend had a threshold of 0 in order to say and act. He needed nothing. He was there. Some people, in response to a product or an injustice or something, need no one else. Their threshold is nothing. Others are like yours truly in this story. They are ones. They need, and I think I probably did need him to go first, but they will follow the ones. Others are twos, and because I was an English major rather than a quantitative anything major, I'm not going to do any math except to say that the endpoint is infinity. The infinites are very interesting. They won't move at all, either because they are frightened or busy, or perhaps just because they're really loyal. Now, this tale of diverse thresholds is a tale of the fall of communism in part. It's certainly the tale of the American Revolution, from the location of which I'm speaking now. And notice, if you would, that with diverse thresholds, things can go very fast or not at all, depending on who sees whom and exactly when. That point suggests the importance of my third moving part of the 4, which is social interactions. Here's just a quotation from someone involved in hashtag #MeToo, broadly understood. And it's a woman named Beverly Johnson who accused a Republican Senate candidate, a politician, of having sexually assaulted her. And the accusation was very credible because she was one of a large number. What she said in a kind of introspective moment, a quiet moment, was, I thought I was his only victim. I would probably have taken what he did to me to my grave had it not been for the courage of the 4 other women who were willing to speak out. Their courage has enabled me to overcome my fear. Okay, we can think of that as suggesting that if the zeros go first and the ones see them and the twos see them and the threes see them and the fours see them, we can have a massively successful musician or actor or cause. We can have Brexit. We can have contemporary populism. We can have Black Lives Matter. But if the twos don't see the ones, or if the fives don't see the fours, or if serendipitously someone is invisible or scared at just the right time, then we will never see the relevant matter in the history books. Okay, the fourth of my moving parts is group polarization. So we've now talked about preference falsification, we've talked about diverse thresholds, we've talked about social interactions. Now, group polarization is also illustrated by a story, which is an experiment that startled me that I was involved in about 15 years ago. In the experiment, we got a bunch of people who were left of center together to talk about whether there should be a treaty to control climate change. And we got a bunch of people right of center to talk about the same thing. The left of center people talked with the left of center people, the right of center people talked to the right of center people. So there's no mixing. What we did was we asked people to say anonymously and privately what their views were on an international treaty, then to reach a group verdict, and then to say again what they thought anonymously and privately. What I was interested in is what would happen to their anonymous private statements after talking with each other. And what happened was very simple and, to me, astonishing. While the left of center people were on balance in favor of the treaty and the right of center people against it, after they talked to each other, there was no talking about on balance. The people who were left of center ended up unified, confident, and extreme. There was some diversity and ambivalence before they talked to each other. After they talked to each other, they went whoosh. They wanted that Paris Agreement yesterday. The right of center people also went whoosh, but in exactly the opposite direction. They had some interest in an international treaty. Some of them were concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. After they talked, Not so. They thought the idea of a treaty was a terrible idea. It would hurt the world. Okay, the basic idea is like-minded people engaged in discussions with each other typically end up in a more extreme point in line with what they thought before they started to talk. And we are observing this every minute of every day on Facebook, on Twitter, and in some places within communities. Okay, now you have the four moving parts: preference falsification, diverse thresholds, social interactions, and group polarization. They help explain, let's call the Tocqueville-Lenin puzzle, which is why people who were there contemporaneously were startled by social upheaval. And they also give a clue about how to make change happen, whether we're talking about selling a product, talking about promoting literature, talking about a cause, or talking about something in culture. There's an authoritarian government, I'll name it on request, but there's an authoritarian government that is showing keen awareness of everything I've described. They allow a lot of online disagreement and dissent. But if there is online disagreement and dissent that says, let's meet on a specific street at a specific time, let's all go there, that's shut down. That's because of the government's alertness to the power of group polarization and the possibility of overcoming high thresholds. For marketing, this often works. Recent research suggests identification of a new or emerging norm can help breed environmentally friendly behavior. Not to say it's the current norm, but to say people are increasingly doing the following. And if you want to take action to prevent police abuse in various parts of the world, that's an entree. Okay, I've left a number of things out, and I'm going to talk about just one. In North Korea, very recently, a woman said, "It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. It was just how things are." The most important word in that is the word want. It would never occur to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. The basic idea there is that desires themselves are often malleable, and giving opportunities sometimes frees people up. The closing words come from a computer program in Syria before the revolution and rebellion there. And what the computer programmer said was, in a kind of summary of what I've tried to sketch, is this: when you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences, that everything is okay, that the economy is good in Syria, that everything's fine. It'll take like 6 months up to a year for him to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels. Then they might start whispering. They won't speak loudly, but eventually they're going to. Thanks.
Terrific, Cass. Thank you for that. And for everybody watching, this is also from his new book, How Change Happens, which I have and recommend. I've got some quick questions and a couple, I think, off of Slido. First of all, it seems with preference falsification, there are many of us as humans who are a bit timid or insecure about showing our true colors, how we feel, or maybe we're just not quite sure, but a little bit of a nudge may ensure that we feel that way, for example, in the group. How do we get an early warning of the size of those who are close to being moved from that hidden, what Ronald Reagan might have called silent majority even? How do we gauge the size of that, whether it's vaccine hesitancy or something else, before it surprises us?
Okay, so there are two things that can be done. Google knows a lot. So they know a lot about what's inside people's heads because people are searching for things that they are reluctant to talk about. And the other is guaranteed anonymity. So my little story about the athlete, he believed his anonymity was guaranteed, so he disclosed. And in the experiment in Saudi Arabia, those young men were trusting that their anonymity is guaranteed. If there's someone who it is known will not tell the world, hey, he thinks this, threatening thing, then you can find out some stuff.
So it's trying to listen for this in a kind of under a cloak of anonymity rather than waiting for people to speak out, whether it's climate change or vaccines or what have you, rather than be surprised. What about as individuals? You talked about the threshold there for diverse thresholds, the zeros and ones and twos, three is infinite. How do you test for that? And can you test for that in an individual?
It's extremely difficult. And one reason is that individuals, even through introspection, may not know their thresholds. So many people who are participating in or joining, take your political cause, your favorite or least favorite one, they may not have known their thresholds. And this is, from the standpoint of predicting social outcomes, very challenging. Let's call it suggestive and impossibility thesis, which is we can't get clarity. But from the standpoint of, the arc of human history, it's also inspiring. It suggests that prediction is really hard. So some fantastic things, take your pick, uh, are possible even at moments when everything seems blocked.
We have several questions on Slido, and I'm going to kind of merge them together because they all have to do with a kind of availability cascade. You've coined the term in the past, a kind of echo chamber effect that we've seen on all the algorithms that on social media that we participate in. So, what, if anything, can be done to ameliorate that, given that you've told us number four, the group polarization makes us more extreme, it does not moderate us?
Okay, so let's talk about two things. There was a time in the United States when people were really scared they were going to get Ebola, even though at that time more Americans had married the average movie star than had died of Ebola. I think at least two of us have married the average movie star. And people weren't thinking, oh my gosh, I might marry a movie star or hooray. The reason they were so scared of Ebola was the availability heuristic. That is the case of a death from Ebola and others elsewhere were really available in the mind, and that can drive up risk perception. Now, an availability cascade is some of the things I've discussed interacting with how the mind assesses risk. Now, if people are really scared about something that's a low level risk, there are a couple things that can be done. One is just to try to point it out as clearly as possible. The other is to do comparative information. You're more likely to marry this movie star than to get that, and that can help. Um, but some availability cascades are actually good things. So, in my view, the response to the recent killing of an African American in the United States by a police officer, that has fueled an availability cascade. That's drawing attention to a long neglected problem. The echo chamber problem is connected, but not the same thing. We in our individual lives can make sure our chamber, so to speak, is larger and more diverse than it was yesterday, and more kind of social changey. That's not a very good word. More social change oriented. Social media providers like Twitter and Facebook can do much better at trying to combat the presence of echo chambers.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's How Change Happens, the latest from Cass Sunstein. Cass, look, we're really grateful that you made the time. We hope to enlist you in the efforts for preference falsifications for good, that people emerge for things for better outcomes. And that in itself may be controversial. Good for whom? So thank you, Cass, very much.
All thanks to you.